everyone. Thank you for being here. First, let me thank Institut Amadeus for inviting me to this very exciting forum and to moderate this very interesting panel. I would like to thank especially the Institut Amadeus president, Mr. Brahim Fassi Ferri, who has done a fantastic job in organizing these forums over all these years. Under the high patronage of His Majesty King Mohammed VI, may God assist him. Now I will say a few introduction words before I introduce my panelists to set up the big picture. So we are going to talk about the new global economic order, basically. Is it a new global order, or is it a transformation of the existing order? This is something that we are going to tackle, and mostly we will address a few questions related to the new economic policies, which are mixing economic motives or economic goals with national security considerations. As you all know, the Trump administration is leading this charge, so to say, but this comes from much deeper historical and political and geopolitical background, and I will ask my panelists what they think about that and how they perceive this, both the transformation that is happening, the way it translates into economic and political statecraft and governance, and what is the end game, or more likely, what are the scenarios that we may envision in the future, how this may evolve, how this situation may evolve, and what are the risks and opportunities that this creates for different economic blocs and countries, especially countries in the so-called global south and developing and emerging countries in Africa and beyond. So after saying these words, let me briefly introduce my panelists. So on my left, I have His Excellency Mr. H.E.Dr, who was former Prime Minister of the Kingdom of Belgium and held many positions in government and in economic and political governance. To the left, we have Dr. Maya Gopal, who is a professor of economics and has a very long and extensive experience working in political economy and sustainability issues, among many different topics that you have tackled in your brilliant career. Next, we have Mr. Sobhi, who is the Vice Minister of Finance of the Republic of Egypt. So he will bring some very interesting and insightful perspective, I think, on the perspective or point of view from the Global South and from the Middle East and North Africa region. And last but not least, Sir Liam Fox, who's distinguished former member of the British Parliament and who held many different positions in government, especially in relation to trade, but also to geopolitics in the Middle East and beyond. So I think this will be very interesting to have your insights also on this evolving global order or disorder, so to say. So, as we say, ladies first, so I would like to pass the mic to Mrs. Gopal, to Professor Gopal. And I would like to ask you, Professor Gopal, how do we think basically we got to this situation in which the basic tenets and basic laws of economy seem to have been disrupted by the policies that have been implemented by many different blocs and powers. The United States, of course, with the tariffs, with Trump's tariffs, and all the restrictions that have been put in place, restrictions to trade, restrictions to technology and otherwise. But also the European Union, which is embroiled in this conflict over Ukraine with Russia, and which has used extensively the sanctions tool and other policies to develop its own strategic autonomy. So how did we get there actually? Is it related to Trump, or is it something that is really deeper, that goes deeper in time and history?
Mm-hmm. No, thank you very much for the introduction and for having me here. It's fantastic right now out of Germany in the middle of the EU to be getting a bigger picture and to really listen how the discussions about the future and what's possible are being done in other places of the world. So I very much look forward to learning, and I have been doing so the last 2 days. My role is as a transformation researcher to look at different drivers of societal change and also obviously economic change. And economics and technological development being at the core of the emergence of different relationships, but also obviously the kinds of rules that we wrap around it to organize cooperation. My prime perspective has always been sustainable development, so coming from the idea that we have to find a development model that will work for all people on this planet, and then increasingly since the 1970s acknowledge that there are particular limits to what we can take from the planet to feed our economies. And I'm saying it this way because I find it very important, and the term geoeconomics that you've put into our discussion actually brings this home, that we have grown accustomed to think of the green issues as something soft, as something on the side, as something that we might be able to protect if the economy is thriving otherwise. And right now we do see, and that's my first point to put forward to understand the situation, how access to resources, which is the core of the definition of geoeconomics, as it was put forward in the 1920s, 30s already in Germany, is really driving some of those conflict lines. And when you look at the battle about Ukraine right now, when you think about what the deals that are being done are having at the core, is also access to what is underground in the Ukrainian territory. When we think about the ideas of annexing Greenland and other places that are resource rich because Donald Trump simply says, we need this, I guess you just understand, in order to fuel our economy, I think it's high time to understand that separating the environmental issues, as we like to call them, from deeply security-related and economic stability issues should be a thing of the past. So having stated this is one of the prime drivers, I think, that we haven't really managed to understand how important it is to seek for solutions that are going to have least impact on what our planet can replenish in order to be serving as many people as possible. And then you just had a long friction. I've been working on world trade for a long period of time, where this whole idea of what are the rules that the world is governed by and whose standards are they protecting and who's more of a rule taker and who's a rule maker, you all know much more than I do, has always been a debate of power and of collaboration, but at the same time also saying who is going to tell the others under which circumstances they are participating in the world markets. Vulnerability arose when we saw a lot of the emphasis on especially poorer countries to say focus on particular products that you're really good at or raw materials, put them in the world markets, and then you get very vulnerable to shocks in market prices. So resilience, I think, is another aspect that's becoming more and more strongly now to the fore after we've had efficiency roped in the way that especially trade relationships driven by big companies, usually sitting in northern countries and having supply chains, as they called it, in other countries. This has been a friction all along. So I think it is very interesting right now to see how this non-alignment to typical blocks in this whole setup of the international order of trade and economic relationships is shaking this idea up. So who is a rule taker, who is a rule maker, I think is on the core of what we're talking about, and this is why I would say we're not only talking about slight modifications, we're really thinking about something different. I do want in this next round to look at Donald Trump and his particular undertakings and what it does with the European Union and the role there, but for now I think we have to understand that the battleground is multifarious. So the resource aspect is important, then we have trade as a big aspect, we have investment. I mean, this whole notion about putting conditions on companies or foreign direct investment to be having to go to the United States and not go to China. I mean, the whole blackmailing aspects that are going on in there. Then finance, the dollar having been in that international architecture of organizing international trade, etc., been the reserve currency, and now the valuation, devaluation attempts. What does that mean? Where are we going with finance as a means of organizing international relations? But I also think that standard setting is something we have to look at, especially in technological development. Who's going to say which are the standards of the new products, especially also what we still call green technologies? I would just say stable technologies when we think about climate change, but also independence from fossil fuels. And what are the different groupings there? There's a demarcation line in international debates between China wanting to lead on the clean technology front, whereas the United States, also because they're heavily exporting energy, fossil energy, them being on the driving seat more to push in the other direction. So I think we have to understand the standard setting and the ideas about what kind of solutions are going to be driving world market relations. And the last one then, I think we really have to shed a light on cyber as well and the whole control over the information society. At least in Europe, I would like to have another round of discussing what kind of information gets where and what kind of control is being exerted through the monopolies in digital infrastructure, in the information, but also e-commerce areas. So the GAFA and their influence on especially democracies and what they deem possible and how stable they are, and what this is as an instrument also impacting on governance outcomes then obviously in Europe, because we're right now finding it very difficult to find a concerted answer to the challenges outlined. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I think we were discussing before this panel about how we came here, and Sir Liam Fox, you told me that actually all these, tariffs, etc., don't really make sense from an economic perspective. So can you elaborate on that, and why do you think, even though that doesn't make sense, why these policies are being now supercharged, not only in the United States, but across the world?
Good morning. And thank you for inviting me back to Tangier again. I start from the position of being an unreformed and unapologetic free trader. I believe that free trade and free markets have been the mechanism by which we have liberated more human beings from poverty than any other. We've taken 2 billion people out of abject poverty in the last 50 years, and to turn our back on free trade will be a mistake of truly historic proportions. I think that since you referenced at the beginning the developing countries need 3 things to be able to economically move forward. They need to have enough foreign direct investment, they need to have mature enough economies, including services, but they also need access to markets. And a lot of the debate on trade recently is being framed as though the trade difficulties we face began with the re-election of the Trump administration, and this is not true. If you look at restrictions on trade, you can see the period where they really began. And at the end of the financial crisis, in the third quarter of 2009, only 0.7% of all the imports coming into the G20 were covered by a restrictive measure. So 0.7% of all the imports into the world's richest countries were covered by a tariff or a non-tariff barrier or a technical barrier to trade. Roll that forward to the first quarter of 2020, and that 0.7% had risen to 10.3% of all imports into the G20. In other words, in the decade following the financial crash, there was a massive increase in protectionism right across the G20. That's a bad starting point for the reinitiation of tariffs, but that's the reality that we need to grasp. The world's richest countries following the financial crash were increasingly putting up barriers so that it made it more difficult for developing countries to trade their way out of poverty. Now, can anyone here tell me they think it's a coincidence that in the same decade we saw a huge rise in mass migration from some of the world's poorest countries? There is an inevitable, but largely at the moment deniable link by Western governments between their own economic and trade policies and the rise of migration. And I would say that if people can see on their mobile phone what prosperity looks like, but they're being denied access to prosperity by the actions of the world's richest, then you cannot be surprised that you get greater migration. And I give that as a baseline for our debate, because I know that we'll talk a lot about Trump tariffs, but we need to understand what has been going on in recent times before we got to that. Now, on the plus side, I would say there's no doubt that there were practices that needed to be confronted in the distortions of global trade, the overuse of non-tariff barriers, legal barriers, environmental legislation, consumer legislation that made it harder for developing countries to trade, and that needed to be dealt with. Mass use of tariffs is not the way to do it. And the number one thing I would say about tariffs is that it forgets that very few of us are producers, but all of us are consumers. I sat on the trade ministers meeting when I was UK Trade Secretary at Davos, and I counted. It took 1 hour and 8 minutes at the meeting before the word consumer was actually uttered. It was all about protecting producers. And that is a fundamental flaw, because we need free markets, because it gives consumers greater choice of better goods at lower prices. And interestingly, in the entire debate in the United States, the word consumer is hardly ever used, notwithstanding the fact that agriculture plus manufacturing constitutes 18% of US GDP, but 100% of Americans are consumers. So we need to get the debate into context. Tariffs are a tax on choice. They restrict what consumers want. They ask the wrong question. The question should not be, how much do you have to raise the price of a German BMW in America to stop Americans buying it? The correct question is, why are Americans not buying American cars? If you ask the wrong question, you'll come to the wrong solution. And I think that the analysis behind the current re-emergence of tariffs is intellectually flawed, and therefore the solutions are intellectually flawed and potentially very damaging, not only internationally, which undoubtedly I think they are, but also domestically from the point of view of inflation and consumer interests.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Although I want to challenge also this idea that, liberalism is the solution to everything, because there are other currents in economics, as you know, that are more, protectionist and that believe that tariffs and other instruments of economic statecraft can also have a positive impact on the economy. I want to have your perspective on that, Dr. Sobhi. I want to recall a historical episode in the history of Egypt, if I remember. In the 1930s, when the world was in the Great Depression, Egypt was one of the countries, then under British protectorate, but with its own government. It was one of the government actually to implement tariffs on industrial goods. And this triggered really a development of manufacturing and industry in Egypt after years of disindustrializations, because it took British products mostly with this free trade consensus or imposed consensus that was prevalent at the time of the colonial rule, but these tariffs actually reversed the machine and had a positive impact, if I recall, but correct me if I'm wrong. So do you think tariffs and other instruments are always the wrong recipe, or they may be helpful sometimes? And more broadly, the transition from free trade to fair trade, is it something that could be positive for countries like Egypt?
Thank you very much, and I'd like to first thank Center Amadeus and the government of Morocco for hosting such an interesting event, and I think I'm delighted to be here with this distinguished panel as well. First, answering your question, no, I don't think that tariffs had helped to build industry or manufacturing anywhere. And I think the experience when those tariffs were imposed was a time where there was a manufacture already. And I think it did not help competition or growing and development of industry. But that said, I think I also think that globalization had helped a lot the global economy during the last 20, 30 years to really make a massive change in terms of growth, in terms of jobs, in terms of income, in terms of reduced inflation for a long time, a longer period. So free trade had helped a lot on improving the competitiveness and the quality of products and services that people are consuming. So that's, I think it's very important to notice, and we are seeing now that any reverse on this had an impact on inflation, had an impact on investments, on trade. So that's, I think, it's being felt now, and if you see the reports that, the current reports, this is expected also to accentuate or to be much more harder on all this in the medium term if it will continue. But the issue here, and not only the developed countries, advanced countries have benefited, but also the emerging economies and the developing countries had also benefited from this. And we are seeing a lot of examples like the reduction in poverty, like the competitiveness of sectors. And I agree with Sir Fox that also most of the industries that are growing are the ones that are not protected. So protectionism is not helping even growing. It could be very temporary or very targeted for a short period, but should not be the norm or should not be the rule that is being done. But that said, also, I think it's important to say that we have been taught and we learned how the importance of free trade, and I think a lot of people are agreeing on this. But the problem now is that the same enthusiasm of how the countries that were advancing this are now reversing it with the same enthusiasm and with the same with the strong arguments as well. And this is the issue, that changing the rule of the game is being done by maybe few countries, and the other, most of the countries are just receiving or what my colleague said, rule taker or rule absorbing. So that's, I think this is the issue, because this is not giving stability to the economic system. The global system itself, when you don't know the rule of the games and they are changing in favor of a few countries, that's, I think, where the worrisome would be. Because when you are having plans, you need plans for a medium, for longer term, and having this change in the game is not helping countries in general. The last thing here in this intervention, I would like to say also that not all countries have benefited from globalization. And this is more, should countries look domestically why they did not benefit, why they kept uncompetitive, why they kept the poverty. And this is where I think the priority is to work domestically and to be prepared to really benefit from this. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I would like to come back to the European Union. You know, obviously, we had this, some would say, humiliating sequence this summer when the president of the European Commission paid homage, so to say, to King Trump or Emperor Trump at his own Gulf resort in Scotland and agreed to sign a trade deal that imposes 15% tariffs on all European or part of European, significant part of European goods exported to the United States without any counter party, and basically opening the European market to US goods. So how is this possible, Yves Le Terme? How did we come to this you know, outcome, and was it something that was inevitable?
Thank you very much, and thank you very much to the organizers and Morocco for having me here on this great event, where over the last couple of days I felt very privileged actually not to listen to colleagues from the West, but to engage in conversations with people from the South, and also witness the dialogue between countries from the global South. Let me start by referring to what I think is important when we talk about economic situations. It is the risk of falling under the temptation of two biases. They have been described in a very accurate way by Hans Rosling, a Swedish former surgeon who wrote a book, Factfulness, and where he demonstrates how we are biased by being prone to negativity. And at number two, we always should keep in mind that we have to counter the proximity bias, which means that, number one, assessing a situation, the more graduated you are, the more you're inclined to see negative aspects. And number two, the closer you are to a situation, the less you're inclined to look at the long-term trends. Having said that, I think the long-term trend is just China re-entering world's history. Of course, there's a sustainability issue, but in terms of global trade, I think China is again the new kid on the block, left the game a couple of centuries and is back now. And we see the fight for the leadership and the US resisting to this, the dynamisms of coming from China. And then the reaction is, and it's unfortunate, but is that trade and FDI, I think currently are too much weaponized. They're used in a fight for leadership, and that's basically one of the biggest issues we have to counter. Of course, this is not 2025. This started under Trump 1, ending at the Chinese side, the golden age of opening up. And so these two dynamisms brought us in a situation where trade, FDI, is used as a weapon to counter the dynamism of the other. Coming back to your introductory statement, the European Union indeed this was quite humiliating. I share the feeling you got, maybe as a non-European, watching what was happening in Scotland. I had the same feeling, to be honest, when I witnessed the NATO summit. I think it was in June, and where my good friend Mark Rutte was put in a position where he had to call Mr. Trump daddy and thank Mr. Trump for his wisdom to impose on the NATO allies raising their budgets to 3.5, 5.0 GDP in terms of military spending. So yes, it was humiliating what happened. I think that the EU is squeezed between the US and China because of this weaponizing of global trade and foreign direct investment, and starting from the fact that we have a mixing up of economic policy and security policy, and Europe is an economic bloc that needs trade as a human body needs oxygen, but that for its security very much depends, and that's a responsibility we have to share all together in Europe. But the fact is that today we are dependent in terms of security at a moment where the war is back on our continent. We are dependent to a very important extent to the US. We are dependent on the US in that field. And in terms of economic dynamism, we are increasingly dependent on China, the raw materials, but also, for instance, in terms of reaching the goals for the climate change issue, I don't see a way to go from our CO2 emissions now to the situation, the goals we have for 2030, without massively continuing to use Chinese solar panels and massively import Chinese cars. That's my personal opinion. I can give you lots of figures and facts to underpin this, but that's the reality. Security-wise, we're dependent from the US, and in an economic sense, we are dependent from China. But this situation was created based on a whole economic philosophy that for the last 30, 40 decades was prevailing. When I was in the leadership of the OECD, 2011 till 2014, it was the big era of the competitive advantages and building global value chains based on competitive advantages. And so G7, all the Western leaders, all the economists actually, were advocating for maximizing the benefits of increased efficiency in using raw materials and human resources by having these global value chains where most of the industrial products travel all over the globe, not internalizing the CO2 emissions and the environmental cost. And so this whole dynamism of building industrial sectors, building big companies based on this competitive advantage of geographical location of an economic activity, this whole theory, which is more than a theory, which used to be a religion, so to say, in the liberal economies, this is now broken up by the fact that through tariffs and through restrictions on export and restrictions on investment, these global value chains are broken up. To finish, 3 remarks about the EU, as you mentioned. So number one, the European Union is very vulnerable to what's happening in the US and China, of course. We have to leave the position as being champions of free trade, I think. We too often take up the responsibility for the global trade, and I think that other players in the game do this to a lesser extent, so I think we should leave this. Number two, I think that the EU unfortunately cannot stay neutral in the clash between the US and China. We have, to a certain extent, because of the security blackmail, we have to choose sides, but the side of a rational US leadership where tariffs are based not just on the fact that you're not proposing the leader of the US for the Nobel Prize, for the Nobel Peace Prize, should not be the argument to put tariffs in place. So the EU cannot stay neutral in this clash between China and the US, and we have to have a very deep dialogue with the US. And last but not least, very importantly, and I close with that, here in Tangier, in Africa, of course there's more than China and the US. I think for the EU, 70% of our trade and investment is not dependent on on China nor the US. And so we should regain this kind of traction we had in engaging in a free trade agreement. The EU has lost over the last decades its strong capacity to strike deals. When I was chairing the Council of EU Heads of State and Government, we were finalizing the deal with Korea. And I remember very well that in the documents that were on the table then, the specialists of the Commission were referring to the Mercosur deal, and that we, on the let's say, the wave of concluding the deal, successfully concluding the deal in 2010 with South Korea, we should try to finalize the Mercosur deal, where we're still there. And so this is really a problem for the European Union. I don't know whether there are French people in the room, but I think we should overcome our hesitations. We have no time to lose, and we should become again the leaders in terms of concluding free trade agreements with other parts of the globe, where there are lots of economies, I think, that are also looking for alternatives to their dependency to the US and to China. I hope this is an answer to your question. Thank you.
Thank you. I want to continue exploring European Union with Professor Goppel, and especially the relationship between economic statecraft and climate policy and the green transition, etc. So this was, at the time, I mean, a flagship policy of the European Union, and it still remains to a great extent. But I feel like this is being challenged right now, not only by the United States, but also by other considerations because of the crisis in Ukraine and the fact that the EU discovered how vulnerable it was to imports of fossil fuels from other countries and other economic powers, not only Russia, but now we could say the same for the United States, for example. So do you think, what is the future of the green transition and the climate policy that Europe has been pioneering and has been leading to some extent in the world? And especially I want to ask you about the carbon adjustment mechanism, which is something that will be introduced next year, I think. And especially in the global south, in China as well, but in developing countries, in Africa and elsewhere, they perceive that as a tariff actually, and they are quite resentful about this new policy, including here in Morocco, for example, which exports many different goods to the European Union, and some of these goods might be, concerned by this carbon adjustment mechanism. So, how can Europe assuage these concerns while pushing its own objectives?
No, thank you very much. I think it is one of the great examples where we have to look at the different toolbox or the variety of tools in that box to be reaching global goals. I mean, it's not the European Union's goal to protect a common like climate. I think especially in the global south, but also Europe now is the fastest warming continent. It is one of the prime areas where collaboration has to take place in order for all countries to benefit. And this is why I think it is important to say, from an economics point of view, the best solution for all that would be a global carbon price. I mean, that's been, when you look at the textbooks, the proposal that's out. But then how do you get there? That's been the big question. And I remember 10 years ago in Germany, there was this whole thing about we can't do anything until there is a global price. And then it was like, but how do we get there? So we have to lead by example. So the introduction of a carbon tax in Germany was taking place earlier, and then obviously it has to be European because you have the markets and you have the discrimination for products being produced in one territory or in one legislative realm unless you're equilibrating on the border. And this is why I think we have to talk about what is a tariff and what is a standard setting mechanism that takes the shape of a tariff. So how do you then make sure that these standards of saying we want to decarbonize through pricing as the most effective mechanism from a macroeconomic point of view, how do you manage without that leading to fundamental detrimental competitiveness issues. And this is where the carbon price adjustment mechanisms come in. Looking from it as the potential, I would say that having seen the increase of carbon pricing mechanisms grow across the world has, or plays to the point of view that it has a positive spill-out effect. Because it is rational for other countries to then say, instead of us paying, or our producers paying to the European Union to be able to sell there, we are going to raise the CO2 price in our countries, and then we can do something with it. We could, for example, support local consumption, reduce energy prices, etc. So you could develop it into a redistributional mechanism. We're talking about the same thing in Germany with the climate money, it's called, so that you pay back from the CO2 pricing to especially poorer households to buffer for them the price increases. So you can become strategic by making it even socially progressive if you want to. Then again, the other problem is, of course, depending on how easily it is to be done within other jurisdictions, I think there needs to be a pragmatic exchange. But do we agree, and this is a question I would like to pose here as well, that carbon pricing is a totally necessary, even if not sufficient, mechanism to get to the climate goals? If that is the case, we do have to have an approach that leads us towards global carbon pricing. And if the CBAM is not the way to go, what is then? So what is the offer on reverse? And if we don't agree that we want to have a global carbon pricing, I think it'd be good to put that center stage and say, what's the alternative then? Unless we say we don't want to even tackle climate change sufficiently anymore. So I think this is how I would look at it. We can talk about instruments not being perfect, but we can talk about the potentials if they're done well, and then we can talk about what are different premises in different countries. So how do we make sure that the bordering agreements work for both sides? But if there's no intent to pursue on climate change, then what is the European Union's response? To say we're not going to protect the climate either? We're the warmest continent, fastest warming continent right now. It's literally our own interest as well to try to reduce the carbon emissions. So this is how I'd look at it, and I think it'd be great to have constructive proposals of how can we move the pricing mechanism forward in a socially just but also fast enough way.
But some would say, for example, that fossil fuels are the most carbon-intensive, products in the world. So it would make sense to tax actually the imports of fossil fuels directly into the European Union, and this will generate also a lot of financial resources that could be, as you say, redistributed to households or to developing countries, etc. So why not impose a tariff on fossil fuels directly, for example, from the US?
Well, there is the other debate, obviously, to say let's have raw material pricing up the valve. That would lead to an interesting pricing mechanism on all limited resources or the ones that we want to leave in the ground, because that's actually what we're trying to get at, right? We want to leave a lot of that in the ground because we know it's going to lead to too many emissions. But then what is the incentive? Make it unattractive as a market commodity. This is where the pricing would go to. And then again, you're thinking about what is the alternative? So how is that incentivizing then alternative solutions for people to work into and invest into? I think it'd be great to have a mathematical equation there to say what could be beneficial and for which countries could that be more beneficial. There's been on the table right now in Belém a whole let's phase out fossil fuels approach led by southern countries. I think Colombia is going to host the next summit on that to say what we need to do is get out of fossils and not just tax the emissions, which is kind of the waste product at the end of the pipeline. I think that would be a fantastic, probably additional approach. Since the carbon pricing, it's so advanced, we have the best information, the best data, etc. already out there. A lot of the investment vehicles are on that. A lot of the risk assessments from our insurers and our financing institutions are based on that mechanism. It takes a long time to build up that data, etc., to have the same clarity and transparency about the effects. I think it'd be fantastic to really look at it as an alternative. And then that could be exactly the kind of pragmatic approach to say how we do this, and could that be an equivalent to?
Yes, I think also one important dimension is how to manage the transition and to support this transition in countries that are neighbors to the European Union, that are integrated with it economically and geopolitically, like Morocco, other North African countries as well, and so to help them actually upgrade their economy and their industry, especially in these carbon-intensive sectors, because right now they feel it's a one-way. It's like a punition from the European Union, and you just have to pay the price if you want to export to the European Union.
No, that's the other aspect. I think this is when we're talking about resilience and we would talk about more regional integration and like-minded. For me, that's been a long-standing approach to say, why don't we just look across the Mediterranean and say, these are the neighboring continents that have mutually beneficial, talking about comparative advantages in terms of what kind of sources of energy here, like wind and solar, can take place. I don't know, 20 years ago, where we talked about desert tech for the first time, to say there is a giant potential here to harvest solar energy, and it could be a trade relationship with the European continent, either through gigantic cables or then now in the form of maybe green hydrogen. So there is this whole purely economic approach to it as well, and I think climate economics, if you want to, or even just safe energy economics, when we think about what we're trying to circumvent, would be another maybe then less contagious way to look at the things, especially when we think about the pressures of some big players in this area to say everybody who says climate change now is going to be on our punishing list. I mean, that's another interesting development. So maybe looking at it from that point of view is the best. And I do agree, there is huge potential for mutual benefits in just making sure the energy economy is working well.
Thank you. Sir Liam Fox, we talked about von der Leyen being humiliated by Trump, but when we look at the experience of the United Kingdom, actually the Prime Minister, Honorable Starmer, managed to achieve a very good deal in Trump, speak with the US. So how was it possible? And does this vindicate the whole idea of Brexit and the fact of global Britain and so on, that was pushed by some people, some political leaders in the UK? And I know you have been in charge of critical trade negotiations at that time, and you still follow these issues.
Well, you're trying to take me down a political rabbit hole that I'm not going to go down on Brexit. When you describe it as a great result that we're paying 10% in tariffs on everything we send to the United States compared to zero before, one can argue how great a result that actually is. And comparatively, of course, it's better, but in absolute terms, it's not. I think that one of the problems that we've been describing here is from developing countries, they ask a very legitimate question, which is, why are these rich countries who themselves have benefited from comparative advantage in trade now beginning to put up barriers to us before we're able to take advantage of comparative advantage in trade? Now, I look at Morocco as a very good example. So Morocco has this big investment recently from the UAE on water and energy. Morocco, now that the issue of Western Sahara is thankfully settled in the right direction, is able to generate vast amounts of renewable energy from wind and from solar. It can therefore, because of its geographical advantages, be involved in massive desalination to the benefit of the Moroccan economy and elsewhere. It can transform itself potentially into an agricultural superpower. And just as it does, it faces increased barriers to its products from the richest countries in the world. Now, people here might be forgiven for thinking there's more than a small element of hypocrisy about all of this. Why are we in this position? I go back to the gradual rise of protectionism, and something we haven't mentioned in this debate about new global economic order, which is the collapse of the multinational institutions, in this case, the WTO, regarding trade. Largely the problem, whether it's CBAM or any of the other issues that we've mentioned, come from the decision to allow China to join the WTO under the guise of a developing economy. I wonder how many people sitting here today recognize that today in the World Trade Organization, China is technically a developing economy, in the same way as some of the poorest economies in the world are. This is clearly a nonsense, but the failure of the developed countries to change the rules relating to China is behind a great deal of what we're trying to do by other means, and not particularly successfully. China has been able to manipulate the global system because of the benefits given to it as a developing economy, when clearly, as the world's second biggest economy, that's not the position that it's in. The CBAM question is, how do we control Chinese exports when China is using the world's most polluting mechanisms to produce those exports? That's ideally done under proper rules and governance by the WTO, not by a secondary mechanism like CBAM, although it's got its advantages. We are not tackling some of these most difficult issues in the global economic environment. The World Trade Organization is a basket case, right? It does not function in any way as it should. And part of that is one simple problem, and I say this because I was the UK's candidate to be Director General. When the WTO was set up under Ronald Reagan, who was a great patron of the WTO, decisions were to be taken by consensus. Now decisions are taken by unanimity, which means that any one country can veto any of the measures necessary to fairly govern the global economy, combining free trade and fair trade. That's essential failure of institutions, which is leading us to scramble to find other solutions to the problems which should have been dealt with by the very institutions that we ourselves set up. We have failed to update those, and I'm afraid a lot of others are paying the price.
Thank you. I think, Yves, you want to say something in response?
Yeah, not so much criticizing what Mr. Fox has said, but still putting a little bit of nuance in terms of the criticism towards China using the benefits of being part of the WTO and with a status which is maybe at this very moment not really appropriated to the current situation. On the other hand, Mr. Fox, I think we should have we should incline to be a little bit humble as Europeans and as Westerners here on the stage in Africa. When we talk about, I think, one of the most positive developments of the last 40, 50 years, where China has managed to, multiply its GDP by 80 over the last 30, 40 years and alleviate hundreds of millions of people from poverty. We've been applying our visions, quote unquote, it's a bit too positive, on the development of Africa over the last couple of 100 years, and we are continuing to teach the others how to behave economically, but I don't see the same progress in Africa. And it's related to, I think, a lack of integration of the market, it's related to governance issues, it's related to our responsibility for the past. But I think to the credit of the Chinese today is that 1.4 billion people, 70–80% have been put out of extreme poverty, and that should be now and then used in a way to nuance our very rational criticism, and with good reason sometimes we have currently towards how China is behaving now, let's say, since the end of the golden age of opening up, which I think more or less ended in 2012, 2013.
Thank you.
So, I don't disagree that that's been a huge benefit, but how long are we going to allow China to be described as a developing country with all the same advantages of some of the poorest countries in the world? It's a failure of the institution, that's the point I was making. Not that China should not have been admitted, but there was never a mechanism for China to move from one of those categories into another. That's been a failure of that. And it is, of course, blocking out a lot of the opportunities for the genuine developing countries in the global economy.
Would you like to add something? shortly?
No, I would love to say that we should be generally a bit more honest. It wasn't free trade, really, when you think about what now China is doing, the export subsidies and the kind of attempts of the European Union to retaliate a little bit, or maybe it's not even retaliation, it's say, let's even it out in electric vehicles. There was this notion of that being retaliatory tariffs, but it was basically an equilibration of what was subsidized on the other side. But we've done the same thing in Europe with agricultural products for the longest period of time. And African continent is exactly on the receiving end of that kind of dumping policy. So there wasn't a free trade agreement in the first place. It was different standards for different parts. And this is why I think the standard setting and then how it's enshrined in particular rules is something we need to really look at with its steering effects and with its power effects. And this is where we're at. And I don't think we're going back. I think we really, and this is what I feel here, there's much more courage right now to say we're not taking rules just like that anymore. We are sitting on a lot of resources, and I think it's part of what China has brought to this continent through its investment and through its interest to really find this self-confidence of and I heard it every day, we have very many resources, we have a young population, and this is mutually double benefits. I think what we now really have to look at, how do we find a development model that gets out of the resource extraction gaps, where we have very unequal development, and then to say what is exactly the kind of standards that we want to look for so that it is sustainable and it is socially inclusive. And it really adds more of the production chain in countries on the African continent and others that have been raw material exporters with all the vulnerability that's come from it. And their local content, I've been working on WTO for a longer period of time as well, was always considered as policy space, but at the same time could be framed as non-tariff or non-financial trade barriers. So we have to make sure that we understand the labeling and what's hiding behind it. There was never anything like free trade. There's always been different variations of shaping rules.
Thank you, Dr. Goepel. Dr. Sobhi, you experienced, I guess, firsthand the relationships with different great powers in different responsibilities, especially with China and with the non-Western powers. As Egypt joined the BRICS under the BRICS Plus format in 2023. What is your experience actually in navigating between Western powers and non-Western powers, and how did Egypt manage, I think, successfully to navigate these geopolitical and geoeconomic tensions that are rising between these two blocs?
Thank you very much for this question. And I think Egypt, like many developing countries, they don't have the luxury to choose about partners, and they have to have, and Egypt especially had good relations with all countries and all parts of the world. So you have a free trade agreement with the EU, we have a free trade agreement with Turkey, we have a trade agreement with Africa, we have a free trade agreement with Arab countries. We have, this is an open relations, but we have a good relations with the US, we have a very good relations with the EU. So we are, and of course with China and other partners. So that, I think it's important to have this good relations with all. But the most important thing, I think, is to look to Egypt, to the Middle East, to Africa, to Morocco, to all these countries as a source of growth for the world economy. And I think this is very important. As we saw, for example, the Eastern Europe, how the advanced European countries have benefited a lot in terms of growth and in terms of a lot of things from the existence of the Eastern Europe. I think that the next period is much more for more on the MENA and for Africa to be a source of growth. So and for these countries, they should not be in a position to choose, because you have a lot of things. You have a very big gap in technology between advanced countries and developing countries. You have for developing countries, you have very high cost of financing. This is not. This is very difficult. So situation are already is not in favor. So any other also on trade, any other protectionism, and I agree that the return of industrial policy, we are hearing this for many years now. It's not something that is related only to recent tariff issues. So this is, I think, it will not help. And having tariff and non-tariff barriers, because these countries need to not only grow to export, but also to grow from exports from basic goods to more manufactured and more sophisticated goods with time. And again, I see partners should be partners in not only on trade, but investments are very important, because it's also, this is how it will create jobs and improve people's lives and reduce the tension and the pressure for something like immigration and these issues. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sabri. I think now we have 10 or 15 minutes, maybe a little bit more, to take some questions from the audience. So if you want to ask a question to one of the speakers or to all the speakers, please raise your hand. And especially the students who are here, I think there are many young people, and you should be really concerned about these issues because they will shape your career and your life going forward. So anyone? Okay, if there is no one for now, we will continue. Yes, go on.
Good morning. Thank you very much for your presentations. Very, very insightful. I'm a FIFA program coordinator at the Nordic Center for Conflict Transformation. You highlighted a lot in CBAM in your talk, and it just got me curious about, you know, how controversial they are, and kind of since this is a Southern Forum, about just the possibility of these CBAM mechanisms of becoming a new colonial tool, since, you know, it imposes tariffs on southern countries or countries of the south, which haven't been historically really responsible for current emissions or the current climate change situation. And given also the very scarcity of climate financing that haven't been really met throughout the years, including this year at the COP30 in Brazil. So all this coupled together, you know, what the potential of these CBAM becoming a form of green protectionism, but at the same time also what concrete on the ground steps that the EU can take in order to assure ensure a coordinated response or approach with South countries to avoid that and to overcome barriers to trade. Thank you.
Thank you. Is there another question? Because before I pass the... Yes?
Merci. Ma question s'adresse à M. Fox. Si vous pouvez nous donner votre appréciation sur la sortie de la Grande-Bretagne de l'Union européenne sur le plan du commerce international. Merci.
Thank you. So maybe we will start with the last question, and then it was what is your appreciation about the UK's exit from the EU and its consequences?
So I voted to leave the European Union, and I campaigned to leave the European Union on constitutional grounds, because I found it unacceptable that there would be a body that was able to make political judgments above the elected parliament in the United Kingdom. It was purely a constitutional issue. When I was explaining it in Washington, someone said, "How could you take such a decision?" I said, if you had a court in Ottawa or a court in Mexico City that could overrule the Supreme Court in the United States and there was nothing that Congress could do about it, and they said, "But we would never have allowed ourselves to be in such a position." That was my case made for me. It was constitutional. My arguments were not economic. They weren't about trade. They weren't about migration. They were based upon issues of sovereignty. And from that point of view, 1 second after we left the European Union, my aims had been achieved.
Thank you. And the question about the carbon adjustment mechanism, who wants to answer? Dr. Goppel, maybe, or Yves?
I will do the introduction for Mrs. Goppel. I think CBAM is a way to internalize the cost of CO2 emissions. I think the underpinning logic of your question, I think, is more related to us paying part of the bill of what has happened in the past. And so I think in Belém, in Baku, and in other places, we had very fierce discussions on financing, adaptation, and mitigation, for, including for developing nations. But as far as CBAM is concerned, well, it has been downsized already over the last months in terms of the scope of the CBAM mechanism. But until now, I haven't seen any other methodology, and Mrs. Goppel has referred to that kind of even scientific work. I haven't seen any other methodology, better methodology than the carbon border adjustment mechanism to internalize in global trade the issue of the cost, the environmental and raw material and mineral resources using aspects of our economic activity. So far, the introduction to Mrs. Goppel.
No, thank you very much. I would love to, as your question referred us to looking at the toolbox, because there's various ways that you can actually support a transformation into a decarbonized economy. Because once you're in a decarbonized economy, you don't have any issues, right? The whole mechanism is supposed to go away when we've achieved our goals. So it's a temporary steering mechanism for markets. And this is exactly how the collaboration, I think, could be looked at in terms of the huge potentials, especially for energy and energy production. Once it goes in the direction of decarbonization, it could be an added value that producing here would have lower CO2 intensity than producing in other places of the world, because you have huge potentials in solar and in wind, maybe even then turning it into green hydrogen producing here. So industry powered by renewables would mean there is no carbon adjustment mechanism for a lot of things that this energy is being used for producing. I would also like to shift the emphasis to what it could incentivize, because we've seen a lot when we talk about agriculture and using ecosystems. Nature-based solutions are something like a CO2 sink. So you can also, through the pricing of the CO2, incentivize a different, very more resilient way of using land, for example, and building up carbon sinks in order to also alert to food security and food sovereignty. So I think it's necessary to really understand what it would do and what it would be putting a price on, and which alternatives would emerge from that if we were taking it consequently. And then how collaboration could support the leapfrogging on the technological space, but also the collaboration of what should then be an agricultural market mechanism, for example, where such steering effects would be put into as well. So then I think we come into finding the best collaborative solutions to come to a regenerative economy, which is exactly what we need. It's not only climate change. We have huge issues on water, on biodiversity, on arable land, etc., as you know much more on this continent until now. But Europe is being resource scarce. So we do need exactly those kind of collaborations, but make sure that the replenishing of what we take from the planet is sustainable in the longer term. And this is where I think it's so important to look beyond the one mechanism and think through what could it lead to long term and how could we turn it into a chance. We have a huge debate on that within Europe right now, because our companies are saying, oh, why do we have to report on sustainability issues? The double materiality. They only see the burden of collecting new data. It's done in a very bureaucratic way. So I think we also have to always look at, is it done badly? And thus the whole instrument is hated because it takes a lot of people, it takes a lot of time to install it. And are we thus shoving out the baby with the bathtub? Because we need the clarity, we need the data, we need the knowledge about how is this environment changing to be able to find the best solutions, because this is real. And this is why I think we have to realign the economic instruments and the way that information is being roped into pricing, pricing being the most important mechanism in markets. And so beyond CO2, there's other elements that should find its space in the pricing mechanism that would allow for producers to bring forward products because they are being given valuation for basically saving water, etc. So this is where right now the EU is going into how to make sure that you can get nature credits. It would be the next step to go into green accounting. So I think it is really about, do we allow ourselves to think what we're trying to do there, which is correcting market failure on a massive scale, to allow for new solutions to emerge, and then how to collaborate on getting those on the ground and make sure it is not something shoved down the throat of others. And I think we're past that point because Europe is very clearly understanding now that it is dependent on collaborative partnerships because it's been threatened by cutting off the supply chains. I think it's a huge potential both for European arrogance to go down and to see how we can actually find the toolbox necessary to leapfrog into a new way of providing for people.
Thank you. Anyone wants to add something, or we have another question?
So maybe on CBAM, I think it's interesting. I think the approach here, and we know that there are good intentions behind that. Of course, climate change is very important. We are in Egypt. We are doing a lot of things on this regard to improve the situation, including the renewables and all. Many things are happening. But the idea is the design of this tool, how it could be, as you rightly said, whether there are any alternatives that could serve the purpose in maybe in a better way, or alternatives. That's, I think, what they can think about. The problem comes when you find that most of the products from the South Mediterranean part that are basic goods will be subject to this. So when you find that most of the exports that are basics or things that can be subject to CBAM, and then you have other things on quotas, and that it provides the idea that there is a lot of protectionism in terms of this. And I think this where the discussion should be, how constructive it should be, on how to serve the objective of climate change and to improve and to lower the carbon footprint, but at the same time without having an impact that can be harmful for other things.
Thank you. I think we have another question here. Please, can you hand the mic? Thanks.
Thank you. Yep. Thank you. I'm Luigi Rebuffi. Been invited here to talk tomorrow, for instance, on cybersecurity, sovereignty, resilience, and so on. And listening to what you're saying, I was thinking that just linking the two things, because we regulate goods and services, but there is one of the most important things in this century are data. And they cross the borders. Certain major countries, they use them, extract value, they monetize it, and we accept this kind of digital colonialism without asking for any tax on that, and simply we support that. What is your opinion? I mean, a bit provocative. It goes maybe beyond ethics and privacy, but there's also some economic value behind this.
Who wants to answer this question about digital sovereignism? Yves? Yes.
Not being an expert on the matter, I would like just to shortly reply that I think the direction you point at could be one of the solutions to the lack of sufficient financing for development. I remember at the summit in Seville some months ago, I was struck by the lack of capacity of the Western countries to go to, on the one hand, being innovative and creative, but on the other hand, to pledge more than they've done until now to make development of, for instance, the continent of Africa possible. And I think that one of the ways to overcome this issue, at a moment where we are doubling our expenditure in military and we are halving our expenditure in development aid, would be a massive transfer of knowledge and results of research in the field of artificial intelligence and new tools, which have the very typical aspect of delocalizing, I mean, the economic activity being less bound by the limits of geographical location. So, but that's only my non-expert personal view on what you pointed at as potential.
Yes.
And maybe I can add a few things, because it was my fifth kind of big game that we're in right now. It has the huge benefits. If we see better, it could be exactly the kind of steering mechanism where we can reconnect financial value with real value. That's the sustainability agenda. How do we make sure extractive use of financial capital is being turned back into productive use of actually creating what is sustained value in the future? On the other side, I think you're alluring to this whole thing of who is owning the data and who's using it to which ends, and how right now there's another area of blackmail towards the EU, which is basically through the gigantic tech companies that are in charge of even our government's emails, etc. So there's this whole fear of, if they were to take the switch and say we're going to lock you down, as they did with a French jurist right now that's on the International Court of Justice, who's been doing a ruling that the United States didn't like, so they've switched him off. He can't even have access to his bank data anymore. So it's become a threat. It's become a mechanism of sowing fear and blackmailing as well. So there's a lot of talk about digital sovereignty right now in the EU, and how can we build up the infrastructure to at all run it on? I mean, the whole construction of server parks and stacks, etc., to potentially develop own AI solutions. So we're not completely being sucked into, with all the data, the big four on the other side of the continent. So there is a whole issue there of who controls information and who uses it in a curated way. Also, when we talk about our country still run by democratic choice, they are using it to manipulate what is factual, what people understand to be having taken place, the whole deep fake aspects. We're seeing a whole issue there of who is governing how people in societies make choices and what access they get to. And this is, I think, a huge issue we really, really need to look at, and to understand that cyber and the curating of information space has become a tool of geoeconomics, but also of torpedoing, especially democratic governance.
Thank you. Sir Liam Fox.
Thank you. So at the beginning, I said that for developing countries to move forward, they needed three things: access to markets, foreign direct investment, and the development of services. And this issue around data, I think, brings you across all three of those. There's no doubt in my mind that the changes in the way that we look at data as a commodity brings security risks, it brings privacy risks, brings other economic risks. Part of the risk is it actually could increase the gulf between the service-orientated rich countries and the goods-orientated poorer countries. But it also brings an opportunity, because the revolution that AI is going to bring means that there will be enormous disruption of the service sectors in the developed countries, particularly in areas like legal services and financial services. That's an opportunity for many of the developing countries to catch up, to go from the back of the curve to the front of the curve if they get the appropriate investment. If you look across the MENA region, for example, and you're comparing services here to the UK economy, which is 80% services in GDP, the US 78.9 GDP, the best in the MENA region is the UAE at 50.1, largely because of the tourist industry that they get there. So there's a massive gap between the developing countries and the developed countries in terms of the level of the service economy. And interestingly, in our discussion today, it's largely been, where we've touched on it, been about goods. We need to think about services much, much more. And data could help drive the growth of the services industry in the MENA region and beyond. But they will require access to foreign direct investment to get it. So the real challenge is whether those who are making that investment can see this region as an opportunity, and whether those in this region can remove the barriers to foreign direct investment, which undoubtedly exist in many ways. But potentially, it is one of the greatest win-wins in the global economy if we can get the balance right. And that's a challenge to both sides.
Do you think there is a rationale for a digital tax, for example, that could be used to finance these industries, these digital industries in these countries, actually including in the European Union and the UK?
No, I think the best way to do it is for countries to recognize that money has no sentiment. Money will go to where money can be made, money can be moved, money can be removed. And, you know, the United Kingdom, we're the world's third biggest repository of foreign direct investment, and it's not because we've got lovely weather. We know the factors that will drive FDI, foreign direct investment, the legal services. Do investors regard your legal system as being sound, predictable, and equitable? Your labor market, is it fair and flexible? Is your regulatory system consistent? Is the tax system permissible? Do you have collaboration with higher education? I hate to say this, but what is the level of English skills? Because that's a key determinant in FDI. Your access to tech and your IP protection. They're the main elements that drive global FDI. What we could be doing as developing countries is helping the developing world improve their ability in every one of those areas to attract foreign direct investment. It's a much more sustainable model than trying to manipulate taxation in the short term.
Thank you. Yes, very shortly, please. You can just talk loud. Parlez à voix haute, s'il vous plaît.
Ça fait, merci. Dans le cadre des accords internationaux sur la décarbonation, on demande aux pays en voie de développement de participer à cet effort de décarbonation, alors que ces pays participent juste à peine à hauteur de 2% de la pollution mondiale, alors que c'est les pays développés qui participent à hauteur de 98%.
What is your question?
Cette problématique de demander à ces pays en voie de développement qui ne sont pas encore dans une phase d'industrialisation de participer à cet effort, alors que les pays développés, industrialisés, c'est eux qui participent en grande partie à cette pollution mondiale. Donc il me semble que ces efforts de décarbonation doivent s'adresser tout d'abord à permettre à ces pays en voie de développement de s'industrialiser avant de faire cet effort vers la décarbonation. Merci.
Thank you. So maybe a short comment on that, and then we will wrap up this session. Anyone?
Maybe, what if we've got some of this the wrong way around? We give preferential access to markets for some of the least developed countries in the world. Why not consider giving preferential access to markets for countries with the lowest carbon production in terms of what they produce? Why not do it as an incentive rather than as a penalization?
Very good proposal. Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you, distinguished speakers, for this very interesting discussion. And I would like to thank the audience, Institut Amadeus, and I hope you enjoyed it. There are other panels after this one today, so I guess there are many interesting topics that will be discussed. And on this, I will end this session. Thank you very much. Thank you.